Hello, I'm JB, the TGN Assistant Content Manager. To celebrate the release of Bioshock Infinite, we are running a special competition where 3 lucky TGN users could win a copy of Bioshock Infinite on their platform of choice. You can find out how to enter and all the other details at our website, www.teengamersnetwork.com. Please remember to read the terms and conditions. Thank you and have a nice day.
I absolutely adore the God of War franchise. Every single game, whether that be on the console or on the PSP, has been an excellent thrill ride full of spectacle and gore. So it's no secret that God of War Ascension was one of my most anticipated titles of 2013. But of course, with that anticipation comes high expectations, since the God of War games have always set the standard for hack and slash gameplay and cinematic storytelling that's both involving and epic at the same time. So going into God of War Ascension, a prequel to the first God of War, I had no idea what to expect. So I guess the question is, does God of War Ascension add another epic adventure to the franchise, or does it disappoint? Let's find out.
Kratos, the great Spartan general, was finally defeated. Driven mad, tortured and uncertain of his surroundings, the warrior found himself captured like a fly in the web of the Furies.
The story in God of War Ascension is set just before the first God of War game. It of course stars Kratos, who is found in an unfortunate position, having broken a blood oath with the gods. Kratos is imprisoned by 3 disgusting sisters called the Furies. The Furies continuously torture and torment Kratos, which manages to ignite the rage inside him, which we all love so freaking much. Once Kratos escapes the confines of his prison, he sets out to cut his ties with Ares, the god who put him in the Furies' hands in the first place, and clear his mind of the Furies' infectious visions. The story in God of War Ascension is, to be put simply, forgettable. The narrative here just seems rushed and unneeded. We were promised an origin story of one of the most badass characters in gaming, and what we get is completely far from it. We learn little more about Kratos than what we already knew, and the small amount of backstory we do get isn't surprising at all and doesn't really add anything to the lore worth noting. The worst part is that Kratos' signature emotion, that being rage, is completely removed here. I get that Sony Santa Monica was going for a more relatable and somber Kratos, but what we get is a character that seems to be muted and it has no real emotions towards anything he comes across. This is mainly because Kratos hardly talks, and because of this we have no idea what his thoughts are towards most plot points in the game. The moments that do have you connecting with Kratos emotionally, like the parts where you have flashbacks of your family, are totally pointless when between these sections you are ripping the heads off anything that moves. The antagonists in God of War Ascension are extremely disappointing too. The Furies aren't that interesting or menacing at all, and they're just forgettable when measured up to Zeus or even Poseidon from God of War 3. It's just a shame because I really wanted to get behind Kratos and look forward to slaying the Furies, but I just didn't care. The story just seems to be barely there, and when it finally does rear its head, it just doesn't interest you, and you find yourself wondering if Ascension's story was even needed at all.
You have fulfilled your promise of greatness. You served with honor. You brought glory to us all. And today, you have earned your place among us as the greatest general Sparta has ever known.
So, there is something you value more than ambition.
The graphics in God of War Ascension are without a doubt the best part of the game. Like any of the previous titles, God of War Ascension looks phenomenal. This truly is one of the best looking games I've ever been fortunate enough to play. Everything looks amazing, from the detailed character models to the huge bewildering environments. Animations are amazingly lifelike and look brilliant as they play out. The game is smooth with a silky frame rate that never drops in the midst of battle, even with crazy amounts of enemies filling the screen. Honestly, everything is spectacularly beautiful and smooth. There really isn't much else to say about the graphics except that they are gorgeous, and the PS3 will probably never see a game better looking than this grace its console. The audio selection in God of War Ascension is great, but doesn't come close to the selection found in previous God of War games. Now don't get me wrong, the cast of voice actors are brilliant and they all play their roles with care and believability, but the soundtrack is what lets God of War Ascension's audio down. It's not bad or anything, but it's just barely noticeable for the most part, and you only hear it come into play when a boss battle begins, which is disappointing, as when you do hear it, it sounds awesome. Other than the soundtrack, everything else is up to the standard you would expect from a God of War title. The voice actors pull off intense performances and give their all. The sound effects, such as the sounds of the different powers Kratos uses, are bass pounding, and enemies all sound as ferocious as ever. It's just the soundtrack that lets the game down. Overall, I would say that the audio found in God of War Ascension reaches the bar expected, but doesn't even try to exceed it.
You're the Spartan that Orcus talked about, aren't you? Definitely need to get this down. Definitely need to get this down.
What do you know of the Oathkeeper?
I know he paid for what he's done. They say he was the first marked one, but his father didn't like the way he turned out. I know. I was the first man to be put here by the Furies. See? I've been keeping a record.
The gameplay in any God of War title consists of 4 things, that being unparalleled hack and slash gameplay, hugely epic boss battles, light puzzle elements, and maybe some SCAD platforming. All these elements are still very prominent in God of War Ascension, but the ratio of these elements is not what you would have hoped. First, let's talk about the hack and slash gameplay. The hack and slash gameplay in God of War Ascension is the most polished combat I have seen in a God of War game. It's fast, it's furious, but most of all it's ridiculously simple to learn and fun to play. You see, God of War Ascension uses easy button combos to make the player feel badass, as even just pressing 2 buttons on the controller can create something truly amazing on screen. You may be saying to yourself, if the game is easy to play, then does that mean the combat isn't challenging? To that I say no, as the game offers up new enemy types and new gameplay elements to the mix that keeps you on your toes. Sadly though, in God of War Ascension you will only be using the Blades of Chaos to slay your foes, but to counter this, the developers have added new powers to add to your blades that change the gameplay up completely. For instance, you can use the lightning of Zeus to electrify your foes, then swiftly switch to the ice of Poseidon and freeze them to death. These added powers are fun to play with and provide an extra layer of strategy, as you will be using different powers for different means. Magic is also used in God of War Ascension as more of a power-up to use in tandem with your Blades of Chaos, which also adds another layer of badass moves to Kratos' portfolio. Overall, I would say that the combat in God of War Ascension is as good as it's ever going to get for the God of War franchise and provides hours of fun. The only downside is that it can get a little repetitive towards the end of the game. Now let's talk about the boss battles, which is arguably the most integral gameplay element to a God of War game. The boss battles in God of War Ascension are as epic as ever and are full of spectacle. The only complaint I have about the boss battles is that there aren't enough of them. God of War Ascension only has about 3 boss battles that are spread out throughout the game that are worthy of the franchise. Instead of loads of pulse-pounding huge battles that we saw in previous titles, we get loads of mini-bosses to pad out the running time. Now don't get me wrong, the mini-bosses are fun to fight and the finishers look as brutal as ever, but the fact of the matter is that coming from a game like God of War 3 that is chock full of entertaining boss battles, then coming to this is extremely depressing. In fact, the boss battle at the beginning of the game, which is also featured in the demo, is the best you're going to get in terms of huge scale boss battles. It's truly a shame as the God of War franchise most memorable moments come from these fights, but here the boss battles are extremely lacking, in turn making the game less memorable than any other God of War title. The puzzle elements in God of War Ascension are a mixed bag to me, as some of them can be brain-teasing and entertaining at the same time, but for the most part the puzzles feel drawn out and annoying. The worst part for me is that this gameplay element is one of the most prominent elements in the game. Some puzzle elements can be great in some games, and some people like a lot of puzzles in their games, but this is God of War. This isn't a slow-paced puzzle game, this is a fast-paced action title. There is just no way this many puzzles belong in a God of War game. Not only do they feel out of place, but the puzzles also mess up the pacing and slow down the game a lot. For instance, you could be fighting a giant boss the size of a skyscraper, then spend about 45 minutes figuring out an annoying puzzle. It just feels badly implemented and not needed. The worst part is that I have a feeling that the puzzles were meant to make up for the lack of boss battles, which infuriates me to no end. The last gameplay element is platforming. Anyone that has ever played a God of War title knows that the series has never done platforming especially well, but we all didn't mind it as the platforming was never at the forefront in any of the God of War games. Sadly though, and for no good reason, God of War Ascension has decided to add a lot more platforming sections to its gameplay. This makes no sense to me at all. God of War has always done platforming badly, so I have no clue as to why the developers thought that adding more of it was a good idea. Seriously, the platforming in God of War Ascension requires no skill and doesn't provide any challenge. It's just really there to pad out the experience and lengthen the game's running time. Overall, I will say that the gameplay in God of War Ascension is not terrible or even bad, but definitely a step down for the series. The multiplayer in God of War Ascension is surprisingly a great addition that actually adds to the experience rather than making it worse. Yes, that's right people, a largely single player game has a multiplayer component that not only adds more longevity to the game, but is also a lot of fun. Crazy, right? Before I talk about anything else to do with God of War Ascension's multiplayer, I would just like to go over how the combat works in multiplayer and why I love it so much. Basically, in multiplayer you have the normal God of War style attacks that usually revolve around mashing the square and triangle buttons, but there's also a twist. Because everyone in multiplayer can do exactly what you can do, you have to be smart and well timed with your attacks. For instance, if in a match a character is about to hit you and you block at the right time, you can then press the X button to parry that opponent's attack and then open up his defenses for a barrage of pain. The best way I can describe the combat is like it's basically a mix between the normal God of War gameplay and a more simplified version of Street Fighter. It requires skill and timing, which makes it challenging yet rewarding at the same time when played correctly. In multiplayer, you have to choose which god you will place your allegiance with. Each god provides a different playstyle and some different abilities. Once you've picked the god you want to bond with, you get to play one of 4 multiplayer modes on one of 8 multiplayer maps, where it's Spartans versus Trojans. The first mode is Team Favor of the Gods, which is where 2 teams consisting of either 2 players or 4 must try and accumulate a target amount of points to win the match. Points are known as Favor, which is earned through killing opponents, capturing altars, collecting red orbs from chests and setting traps. Team Favor of the Gods is my favourite game mode in God of War Ascension's multiplayer, as the mode requires you to work as a team and defend your altars while also slaying opponents, not to mention the pulse-pounding amount of chaos that takes place on screen in a 4v4 match. The second mode is Match of Champions, which is basically a deathmatch variant on Team Favor of the Gods. There's not much to say about this mode, as it's basically the same as Team Favor of the Gods, only this time you fight on your own. Then you have Trial of the Gods, which is where you, playing solo or with another player, go up against 5 oncoming waves of enemies as the timer ticks down. The more kills you get, the more time is added to the clock. Once you have battled the 5 waves, you face a boss fight. This mode adds co-op to the multiplayer, and for the most part it's done really well. You'd be surprised to see how well co-op actually works in God of War. The only downside to this mode is that there isn't a way to add more waves, and because of this, after a while this mode becomes a bit stale. Lastly, we have Capture the Flag, which is what you'd expect. You and your team must battle your opponents and steal the opposing team's flag and return it to your base. I generally don't find any Capture the Flag game type fun in any game, and it's the same for me here. I just don't find it fun, but for those people who do like this game type, you will have a blast.
Spartans move toward victory.
God of War Ascension is in my opinion the worst game of the God of War series. It's definitely not a bad game by any means, but it just doesn't live up to the God of War name. The game does have its positives, such as the graphics and the art design, the combat, the sound selection, and the surprisingly good multiplayer, but so many aspects are a step down. The story is boring and forced, the pacing is terrible, the overabundance of puzzles and platform is straight up dumbfounding, and worst of all, the lack of boss fights is disappointing to say the least. With all that said, I'm going to give God of War Ascension a saddening 7.5 out of 10. I really wanted to love this game, but so many things annoyed me and made me angry. In my personal opinion, I think that God of War Ascension shows that the series is growing weary, and I feel that this is it for Kratos' story, and that it should be left in peace. Here's hoping that Sony Santa Monica announces a new IP, as that would definitely be something I'd want to see. God of War Ascension was provided to me by Sony Computer Entertainment and is only available on the PlayStation 3. I would like to thank them for sending me this title for review. Hey guys, if you liked the review, then subscribe to the channel and check out the TeamGamersNetwork.com, as we have a ton of gaming goodness waiting for you. Also, if you're interested, I have a Twitter and I post a lot of gaming updates, so be sure to follow me if you love gaming as much as I do. Bye guys.